August 8, 2020. One misstep, 1 second of miscalculation. And Simon Cowell, the king of television, was lying broken, his back shattered, his life on the line. The surgeon warned, "You may never walk again." But here's the question. Was this accident the ultimate test, or just another chapter in a life already marked by tragedy? Behind the $600 million empire, the smirk and the words that made or broke careers, lies a story of childhood neglect, betrayal, near-fatal accidents, and devastating loss. This is the Simon Cowell the world never saw, the man who judged millions, now confronting his toughest challenge, his own life. The Invisible Boy, London, 1959. In a quiet town called Elstree, a boy was born into a family that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. His mother, Julie Brett, was a ballet dancer who moved with grace, but remained emotionally distant, as if her love was something choreographed rather than felt. His father, Eric Salig Philip Cowell, a music executive, measured success in achievements and discipline, but never in warmth. Years later, Simon would confess something that still cuts deep. "My father never said, 'I'm proud of you,' even when I needed it the most." That absence of 3 simple words became a wound that would never fully heal. School was no better. At Radlett Preparatory School and later Dover College, Simon wasn't the star student his parents imagined. He was the restless kid who broke rules, clashed with teachers, and carried the shame of disappointing everyone around him. He scraped through with just a GCE in English and sociology. No honors, no recognition, just the crushing weight of not being enough. By his late teens, rejection had become his closest companion. Out of pity, not pride, his father got him a job in the mailroom at EMI Music, the very bottom of an empire built on stardom. Every morning, Simon carried coffee to producers who never learned his name. He sorted fan mail for artists whose songs filled arenas, while his own presence dissolved into nothingness. "I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight," he would later recall, his voice still carrying the ache of those days. He left EMI once, too humiliated to stay. But the world outside offered nothing but more rejection. So he crawled back to the same mailroom he had once despised. In those days, Simon admitted something that broke his heart. "I would cry quietly in the bathroom after work, tears not just of failure, but of the haunting fear that my life had already peaked before it had even begun." But in that rubble of humiliation, something began to change. The silence of his childhood hadn't destroyed him. It was hardening him. From neglect, he carved resolve. From rejection, he learned defiance. The Invisible Boy was about to force the world to notice. From ashes to empire. Armed with nothing but stubborn will and the bruises of rejection, Simon returned to EMI's mailroom, not as a defeated man, but as a student of power itself. He studied how fame was packaged, how stars were created, how dreams were sold. By the early 1980s, he took a massive risk. With E&S Music, he launched Fanfare Records. At first, it seemed blessed. Hits like Sunita's "So Macho" made Simon the boy who had once been invisible, suddenly visible everywhere. Parties, champagne, handshakes with people who once ignored him. He was finally tasting success. But champagne can sour in an instant. The market shifted, trends died, and the empire he thought he was building collapsed with brutal speed. By the decade's end, Fanfare was nothing but an empty shell. Offices abandoned, contracts worthless. Simon, barely in his 30s, was left with nothing but debts and despair. Friends vanished, doors slammed, creditors circled. He returned to his parents' home, retreating to the same childhood bedroom that once echoed with loneliness, a room that now whispered failure. "That time nearly broke me," he would admit years later. "I felt like a ghost haunting my own life." It was a cruel reminder that in entertainment, triumph is fragile and cruelty is constant. But Simon didn't stay down. He began to rebuild, not with ego, but with brutal honesty. He stopped chasing critics' approval and started following the pulse of ordinary people. "I learned the hard way," he said. "Sell records first, earn respect later." He signed acts others mocked, pop groups like Five, boy bands like Westlife, duos like Robson and Jerome. Critics sneered, journalists scoffed, but their records sold by the millions. Still, every success came with the dread that it could all collapse again. "There were nights I lay awake, convinced I would lose it all again," he confessed. Then came 2001, the year that changed everything. The judge who changed television. Pop Idol launched, and Simon Cowell stepped out from the shadows of boardrooms onto the blazing stage of television. Many believed he was unfit for the screen, too blunt, too cold, too cruel. But what they called cruelty, audiences called truth. His sharp tongue, piercing honesty, and refusal to sugarcoat failure electrified viewers weary of polite lies. Pop Idol became a phenomenon. When American Idol launched in 2002, the transformation was complete. Week after week, millions tuned in, not just to hear singers, but to hear Simon's verdict. His cutting remarks, his raised eyebrow, his withering silences. By mid-decade, with the X Factor in the UK and Got Talent spreading worldwide, Simon Cowell was no longer simply a music executive. He was the arbiter of dreams, a man whose words could make or break lives in an instant. At his peak, more than 600 million viewers across 100 countries were watching formats stamped with his name. He was, as the press declared, the most powerful man in television. But power carries a heartbreaking price. The same bluntness that made him famous also made him despised. He was booed in public, ridiculed in tabloids, painted as a villain. "I knew people hated me," he admitted, "but I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." Behind the cameras, the schedule was merciless. Endless auditions, live shows, global franchises. The crushing responsibility of carrying entire brands on his shoulders. The higher he climbed, the more isolated he became. Success filled his bank accounts, but drained his sense of belonging. Friends drifted away. Romances faltered. He confessed with raw honesty, even in the middle of filming, surrounded by lights and applause, I often felt completely alone. The cruel irony was devastating. The man who gave millions their moment of recognition often ended his own nights with no one to recognize him. The scandal that shook everything. February 2014. When Simon Cowell first held his son Eric in his arms, cameras captured a smile. But they couldn't capture the storm that little boy had silenced. Only months earlier, in 2013, Simon's carefully constructed world imploded when news broke that he was expecting a child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew. It wasn't just gossip, it was a firestorm. Headlines screamed betrayal. Tabloids dissected every detail. The man who had once controlled countless careers suddenly found himself trapped in a narrative he couldn't escape. Overnight, he was cast not as the master judge of talent, but as the judge. The betrayal stung deepest, not in public outrage, but in the quiet abandonment of friends who turned their backs, in whispers that followed him into every room, in the crushing realization that trust, once broken, is rarely repaired. Andrew Silverman filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Simon, once the figure of power and certainty, longed only for invisibility. He later admitted in one of his rarest moments of candor, "It was not something I'm proud of." No excuses, no spin, only heavy regret. For a man who had built his empire in control, it was the most powerless moment of his life. And yet, from that chaos came unexpected rebirth. When Eric was born, the narrative shifted from scandal to salvation. Simon's world, once measured in ratings and revenue, suddenly revolved around tiny hands and bedtime rituals. The man who once barked orders in boardrooms now learned to read children's books in the quiet of a nursery. "My priorities changed completely," he confessed. "My world suddenly wasn't about ratings or contracts, it was about him." Those closest to him saw it instantly. One associate recalled, "Fatherhood saved him. He was on a dark path even before the scandal. Eric gave him a reason to stop, to heal, to begin again." But redemption is never without scars. The loss of friendships, the erosion of trust, a guilt that lingered like a shadow. "I lost friends. I lost trust," Simon admitted. "But I gained something I never knew I needed." The paradox was stark, a miracle wrapped in controversy, a gift born from ashes. What made his transformation compelling was its authenticity. It wasn't staged for cameras. It was visible in the softened edges of a man once defined by sharpness, in patience that replaced harshness, in humility that success had never taught him. Fatherhood didn't erase the scandal, but it gave it meaning. The losses that broke him. In 2015, just as Simon was learning to steady himself in fatherhood, life dealt him a blow that no amount of fame could soften. His mother, Julie Brett, passed away at age 89. To the world, it might have seemed a natural passing, but to Simon, it was devastation. Julie had been the anchor in a stormy childhood, the silent witness to his rebellions, the one figure whose approval he always longed for, even when it was rarely spoken. When she died in July, Simon stepped away from the X Factor, canceling commitments and retreating into grief that stripped him of the armor he'd worn for decades. But the ache was sharpened by a wound that had never healed. Back in 1999, long before global fame, Simon had buried his father Eric, a strict but guiding presence, who never lived to see his son rise from bankruptcy to become a household name. For years, Simon carried that regret quietly, knowing the one man whose approval he'd chased the hardest never got to witness the success that Need created. Now, with his mother gone as well, Simon felt as though the last thread tying him to his roots had been cut. "Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever gone through," he admitted softly. No spotlight, no success, no ratings victory could fill the void. The pain was compounded by timing. Only a year earlier, he'd embraced the miracle of fatherhood. Now that joy was shadowed by grief, as if life demanded a cruel balance, giving him a son while taking away his mother. And yet, even in heartbreak, there was transformation. Julie's passing forced Simon to confront not only mortality, but legacy. He began to speak more often about family, about being present, about cherishing moments that fame so often steals. Those who worked with him noticed a new patience, a softness, a vulnerability that had rarely surfaced before. When everything shattered, August 8, 2020. At 60 years old, when many dream of slowing down, Simon Cowell was struck by a tragedy as brutal as it was heartbreaking. In the courtyard of his Malibu home, testing a powerful new electric bike, 1 second of miscalculation turned curiosity into catastrophe. Thrown violently to the ground, his back shattered in multiple places. In that instant, the man who had built an empire on unshakable control lost all of it. He would later recall chillingly, "I came within a minute of not making it." The injury was devastating. 6 excruciating hours of surgery, a steel rod implanted in his spine, the terrifying verdict that one wrong movement could cost him mobility forever. For a man once defined by upright posture, sharp suits, and commanding authority, the irony was tragic. The titan of television was suddenly confined to a hospital bed, struggling to lift a glass of water, unable to sit without agony. "The pain was beyond anything I'd ever endured," he admitted with no bravado. Nights became merciless marathons of torment. But the most heartbreaking pain wasn't physical. It was the thought of his 6-year-old son, Eric, a little boy who idolized his father. "I thought of Eric, and I knew I had to fight," Simon confessed. That trembling honesty revealed a man stripped of all armor, fighting not for empires, but for bedtime stories and the chance to hold his son again. The recovery was cruel. Standing required assistance. Shifting in bed felt like climbing mountains. Entire seasons of television passed without him. Slowly, agonizingly, he took his first steps again. Each one a triumph against despair. Eric became his greatest healer, cheering his father's faltering strides, reminding him daily why survival mattered. But just as Simon began to reclaim strength, fate struck again. In early 2022, he suffered a second e-bike accident, this time shattering his arm and bruising his face. Though less life-threatening, the humiliation was merciless, a cruel echo of his earlier fall. Once more, he found himself in a hospital gown, stitched and scarred, mocked in headlines that called him reckless, fragile, even foolish. To be knocked down once was a tragedy. To be knocked down twice felt almost like punishment. "It changed me in every possible way," Simon later admitted. Both accidents became a mirror. He reflected on the reckless pace, the sleepless nights, the endless hunger for empire, and realized none of it mattered without health, without family, without tomorrow. The face he couldn't recognize. By the time Simon entered his 60s, he had endured scars both emotional and physical. But nothing prepared him for the cruelest wound of all, one etched onto his very face. For years, Simon had dabbled in cosmetic enhancements. Botox here, fillers there. Each procedure justified as maintenance, a shield against age. At first, the changes were subtle, but as interventions multiplied, the shield began to crack. By 2021, fans and critics stared in shock at a man who no longer looked like himself. His once expressive features seemed stiff. His trademark smirk froze. His cheeks were oddly swollen. Headlines blared, "Simon Cowell, what happened to his face?" Memes spread mercilessly. Online forums dissected every frame. The man who had made a career out of judging appearances now found himself judged, mocked, and ridiculed. For Simon, the irony was brutal. He had built an empire in control, yet here he stood, unable to control his own reflection. In later interviews, he admitted with uncharacteristic humility, I went too far. There was a point where I looked in the mirror and literally didn't recognize myself. That confession carried more weight than tabloids realized. It wasn't just cosmetic, it was existential. For a man who had clawed his way from invisibility to omnipresence, losing recognition in his own mirror was its own annihilation. Simon began withdrawing from the spotlight. He reduced appearances, skipped promotional tours, and allowed others to take the front seat. "I don't need to be everywhere anymore," he said quietly. "I just want to be there when Eric laughs." Yet the scrutiny didn't stop. The paparazzi trailed him. Tabloids speculated about new procedures even when none existed. For the first time, Simon understood what it meant to be the object, not the observer. The judge had become the judged. From that humiliation came clarity. Simon chose to stop. He abandoned cosmetic treatments, vowing to let nature reclaim what needles had altered. Enough, he decided. Let it age. Let it show. It was more than aesthetic. It was a declaration of peace with himself. When Simon eventually re-emerged, it wasn't with artificial youth, but with the authenticity of a man who had survived public ridicule and chosen honesty over illusion. Fans who once mocked him now saw something different. Humanity. Perhaps that's the legacy of this chapter. A reminder that even those who sit in judgment are not immune to insecurity, and that the greatest courage is accepting the truth of time. The goodbye that shattered him. September 2024. Just when Simon had begun to imagine the autumn of his life as one of gentler rhythms, fatherhood, reflection, a slower pace, tragedy arrived with a cruelty beyond comprehension. Liam Payne, the boy Simon first encountered at 16, standing nervously under stage lights, yet carrying a voice filled with unshakable promise, was suddenly gone. Not after decades of stages and sunsets, but violently at only 31 years old. A fall from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires ended a life that had only just begun to unfold. For millions of fans, the news was shocking. For Simon, it was devastating in a way words could scarcely hold. Liam wasn't just another contestant. He wasn't just another star in a catalog. He was family. The boy Simon had placed in one direction, the band he carefully pieced together in 2010, a group that became a phenomenon and defined an entire generation. Simon remembered that audition, the nervous laugh, the flicker of determination in Liam's eyes. A simple yes had unlocked a journey that seemed destined to last decades. To see that light extinguished so abruptly, Simon would later say, was like losing a son. Simon knew loss. He had buried his father in 1999. He had laid his mother to rest in 2015. He had survived his own near-fatal accident in 2020. But this was different. Those earlier goodbyes, however searing, had come in the natural rhythm of life. Liam's death was unnatural, merciless. A young man ripped away in his prime with unwritten songs left hanging in the air like unfinished prayers. Too young, too soon, too cruel, Simon whispered to a close friend. And that, more than anything, was the truth of it. The world mourned in chorus. Cities glowed with candlelight vigils. Fans flooded social media with lyrics, photos, and broken words of disbelief. But Simon's mourning was solitary. Projects were halted. Cameras switched off. The man who once dominated global primetime chose silence. His nights were no longer filled with bright studios, but with quiet hours alongside his son, Eric. Friends noticed how he held Eric tighter now, as if every laugh, every bedtime story carried the weight of something sacred. It was as if he was trying to give Eric every moment Liam would never get to give, one recalled. In private, Simon returned to the beginning. He replayed grainy audition tapes of Liam and the boys, so young, so full of untamed hope. What once felt like nostalgia became ritual mourning. Each laugh on tape was a wound. Each song is a ghost of what might have been. For the man who built careers and engineered culture, the helplessness was unbearable. He could design empires, he could create stars, but he could not rewrite this ending. And in that powerlessness, reflection took root. Simon began to speak differently. Not of ratings, but of legacy. Not of empire, but of family. Not of ambition, but of presence. The sharpness that once defined his voice softened, weighted now with the awareness of how fragile life truly is. Liam's death didn't just grieve Simon, it scarred him. It became the mirror he could not avoid, showing him the cost of fame, the brevity of life, and the truth that even the brightest lights can be extinguished without warning. One Direction had been more than a band. It was youth, hope, unity. Now, with Liam gone, a piece of that symbol was shattered forever. The man who learned to live again. By 2025, Simon Cowell is no longer the ruthless judge who ruled television. At 65, he still sits on the Got Talent panel, but his role is no longer about dominance. His verdicts are softer, his wit warmer, and his patience forged by years of survival. Every word carries echoes of pain. Every smile reflects trials endured. Since his 2020 spine fracture, mornings start with careful Pilates. Meals are meticulously planned for health, and dim lighting reminds him of his fading vision. Yet his greatest joy comes from simple moments with his son, Eric. Bike rides, piano lessons, and bedtime stories. These ordinary rituals have become his strongest medicine. While his $600 million empire, including luxurious homes, supercars, and franchises, remains intact, Simon now views wealth with detachment. His focus is on legacy, channeling fortune into foundations, scholarships, and opportunities for children who start with nothing. "I don't want Eric to inherit money," he says. "I want him to inherit values." His appearance reflects this transformation. Gray-streaked hair, lined face, and a slimmer frame. Once obsessed with youth and perfection, Simon now embraces age with dignity. His projects center on impact, not empire. Charity concerts, creative incubators, and mentoring young musicians. Simon Cowell's journey has been defined by survival. A childhood starved of affection, bankruptcy, scandals, near-fatal accidents, and devastating personal loss. Yet he endured, rebuilt, and found purpose. He no longer chases the spotlight. He chases peace and family. Today, Simon Cowell stands as proof that true strength is not in never falling, but in rising each time. The ruthless judge has become a humbled mentor, a devoted father, and a man who embodies resilience, love, and purpose. If Simon's story moved you, drop a like and leave a comment sharing what lesson hit you the hardest. Subscribe to keep exploring the untold stories behind the legends we think we know. Because the truth is always deeper, darker, and more beautiful than fame ever shows. Legends like Simon Cowell don't disappear. They simply teach us that survival, not success, is the truest measure of a life well lived.